Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg. Jacob, I'm finding ourselves, in the position of the Red Queen, wasn't it, in Alice in Wonderland, who had to run to stand still, because by the time our listeners hear this Moggcast tomorrow morning, I dare say more people will have resigned. Scott Mann resigned as a PPS this morning. I just wanted to ask you, these resignations, are they being coordinated?
Not by me, and not as far as I know. I think what is happening is that people have been reflecting on the white paper, on the Chequers deal, and they've been speaking to their constituents. I was campaigning on Saturday morning in the Keynsham High Street, and everybody who came up to me was against the Chequers deal. Some of them were against leaving the European Union altogether, two of them actually, and everyone else felt that it wasn't delivering what had been voted for, even if they had voted Remain in the referendum.
Let me come back to that in a moment. I just wanted to stick with the resignations for a moment. Not coordinated by you, and as far as you know, not coordinated at all, but they are coming out at a remarkably steady and spaced rate.
Yes, indeed, but they're not coordinated by me, and nobody said that he or she is coordinating them to me. So if they are coordinated, I don't know who is doing it.
On the customs bill amendments, which again will have been tabled and debated and voted on by the time our listeners hear this Moggcast, could you just give a description, because people will be listening to this tomorrow morning and catching up with the news. Could you explain what you're trying to do today?
Yes. Well, the four amendments to some extent help government policy. Two of them are completely in line with government policy. That is to say, the one that says that Northern Ireland mustn't be in a different customs union from the rest of Great Britain, that it must be part of a single United Kingdom whole. That is government policy, and it's just a suggestion that this should be in clear legislation rather than a government promise. The next one that is government policy is on VAT, and the VAT arrangements with the European Union are very particular, and that should not be replicated once we've left. That again is government policy. The third is not strictly government policy, but is in line with what the government has done before in terms of Henry VIII clauses, so that should the government wish to remain in a customs union, it would have to legislate for it with primary legislation, a new Act of Parliament, rather than using secondary means. The fourth is not government policy, but probably ought to be. It's a demand for reciprocity. So it says, if we're collecting the EU's taxes, then EU member states must collect our taxes when goods enter the European Union. And the reason for that is it'll be very difficult to run an independent trade policy if any goods that come to us via the EU, with a lot of goods coming into us via the Low Countries particularly, would be subject to an EU tax and not a UK tax. It would make it very difficult to apply anti-dumping duties should we wish to do that. And so this is to ask that what's good for the sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander.
Would you have tabled these amendments were it not for the white paper?
The white paper has been very significant in the decision to table amendments, because the real difficulty with Chequers and the white paper is not so much the policy, though I don't think the policy is a good policy, but that it's moved so far away from what we were told would happen before. And it's the issue of, isn't it better to have things in legislation rather than simply rely on earlier speeches and so on, because things have changed so much.
As you said a moment ago, that these amendments are either in line with government policy or the government could adopt them. But just to be clear, it doesn't sound to me as though you would have tabled them were it not for the white paper. You're seeking a degree of surety that you weren't seeking before.
That is correct.
And let's therefore discuss the white paper and the reaction to it. Can I just pick you up on something you said? Because I've just seen your colleague Paul Masterton has tweeted that his association membership over the weekend has gone up. Now, I'm sure that, we know from Conservative Home that lots of people are very angry and disappointed about this proposal because we're getting the emails that are intended for CCHQ and which come through to us. But could it be that party members are less angry about this than we think, because a lot depends on the local MP? So if the local MP is strongly opposed to the proposals and the background to them, he or she tends to pick up the noise of opposition. Whereas, and I've spoken to one or two who support the government wholeheartedly and support the white paper, they claim they've had very little knocking on their door at all.
There is always, in any anecdotal evidence, a confirmation of one's bias to some extent, because people are, on balance, more likely to come up to you and say, I agree with you completely than not. I found it very interesting talking to some of my Remain supporting fellow MPs who have been absolutely astonished by the reception they've got from their associations. Letters coming in from people that they respect and whose views they value, saying that this is not what we've voted for. So I think that it's wider than just Leave MPs getting a Leave reaction. And what I was doing on Saturday morning wasn't speaking only to Conservative members, it was going up and down the high street with anybody coming up to me who wanted to talk to me. And that probably gets you a wider feeling than exclusively talking to one's own membership.
What do you think of what we read, by the way, about Conservative MPs such as Andrea Jenkins being threatened with having campaigning resources and money withheld from them?
Well, this is a confusion between where authority lies within the Conservative Party, that donors give money to central office and the whips run Parliament. The whips do not run central office funding, and these two, it's very important that they're kept separate, because I think donors would be pretty unhappy, many of whom are quite Eurosceptic, if they thought that there was an effort to penalise Eurosceptic MPs.
The party chairman was reported in one instance to have spoken to a backbencher, not the whips.
I'd seen it as coming from the whips. I think the party chairman is ill-advised to do that, because many of the donors are backers of leaving the European Union, and I think any MP threatened with that would find that they would get more than enough from direct contributions. I don't think it's a proper threat to make, and I don't think it's an effective threat to make.
I'm going to move to this question now. It was among the ones I'd planned to ask last, but we seem to be here anyway. Could the Conservative Party split?
I think this is up to the Prime Minister. You see, I think the Prime Minister had a united party on the Mansion House speech, and she then said on the MAR programme that, well, the EU wouldn't accept it, and therefore I couldn't do that. Whereas it actually then looks as if she's been planning this common, for which read European rule, but for quite a long time. And that is where the split comes. She had a united party in March on the basis of the Mansion House, and then has then decided to give in to the EU. And this is very unfortunate, and it would be very, very damaging for the Conservative Party if this unsatisfactory deal were pushed through against the wishes not just of Leave supporting MPs, but also Leave supporting members and Leave supporting voters on the back of Labour Party votes.
What you're saying, in short, is that she, the Prime Minister, could, if she mishandles this, split the Conservative Party.
Yes, I think that's right. I've kept on saying this. This is not a new thing for me to say. The Prime Minister has a choice. She can either do a U-turn and go back to the Mansion House settlement, or she can get it through potentially on Labour Party votes, which is very divisive, splittist.
In the event of this split, she would be, and the parallel is in some degrees misleading, but it may be useful, she'd be in the position of the Peelites in the 1840s, wouldn't she? She'd own, or I presume the leadership would own the party, the resources, the name, the money, the constitution. you'd have to go off elsewhere, wouldn't you?
No, that's clearly not right, and it's not what happened in the 1840s, is it?
Isn't it?
No.
The Peelites continued being Peelites. The protectionists had to go off and...
No, they remained the Conservative Party. And Peel remained within the Conservative Party. He didn't leave the Conservative Party. But some of the others did. So Gladstone did eventually go over to the
After
Liberals.
quite a long time.
After quite a time. But you have a period of confusion, essentially, and you have blocks in Parliament with no one overall party getting a clear majority, and that getting governments that are supported by the Whigs and the Peelites and so on. So it's not as simple as one side owns the party. Everybody, to some extent, remains within the party.
In that period, if I remember rightly, the one constant was the protectionists and the Peelites would not work together after the split.
Yes, they wouldn't. That's right. They wouldn't work together. There are periodic efforts to try and bring them together, and periodic discussions of coalitions. Derby at one point even offers Palmerston a post. So they try and create quite widespread coalitions. I don't think one can make precise parallels with the 1840s.
Particularly since now, this is the age of mass elections. You didn't have mass elections in the 1840s. So the inference is you'd have whoever the equivalent of the Peelites is, you know, let us call them forever the Mayite Conservatives, standing in constituencies against the protectionist or Disraelian Conservatives, in this case the Rees Mogg Conservatives.
No, I think this is going too far. I don't think this is going to happen. I actually don't think there will be this split, because I think it's more likely the policy changes. When you've got a position where neither Peter Mandelson nor Ian Duncan Smith supports the policy, it seems quite difficult to get it through.
Now, of course, Mandelson is doing this for what we would call his own reasons, is he not? And the phrase he used, I think yesterday I saw, was the worst of all worlds. Coincidentally, this phrase is also used by Justine Greening this morning, who's come out in favour of a second referendum. It seems to be the case, doesn't it, that what you might call the ultra-Remainers believe, not without reason, that the Prime Minister is weak. And whereas you see a way to a different form of leave, a purer form of Brexit, you might call it, they draw from the same facts another possibility, namely stopping Brexit altogether. That's what's going on, isn't it?
I think stopping democracy altogether would be a better way of putting it, and that will not work. We are a fundamentally democratic country, and so many people who voted Remain, according to opinion polls and people that one meets, even though they would have preferred us to stay in the European Union, recognise and feel strongly that a democratic vote should be followed. And so I think this idea that Brexit can be stopped and reversed is a mistake, and is a risky mistake. I think it would cause great discontent in the electorate.
You would vote against the white paper proposals were they to represent a deal, would you not?
Yes.
And if that happened and were the deal to be voted down, what do you think would happen in Parliament then?
It depends on the government. The government controls the parliamentary timetable, and the legislation is in place for us to leave without a deal. There is no mechanism for Parliament to introduce legislation and have the time for it unless it is backed by the government. It's possible for Parliament to change standing orders to do this, but that's a very complex process, and the government would have to provide time for that anyway, and it would require a lot of contingent votes which don't normally happen with without a programme motion, which can only be provided by the government. So the parliamentary formalities mean that a government that wanted, having lost this deal, to proceed with no deal would be able to do so.
You're convinced that's the most likely outcome, I think, from talking to you about this over a period of time. Was other people drawing, it may not be an exact parallel, but they would cite the Norway debate, which was, a debate on the adjournment, and would say, well, if the Commons decides it wants something badly enough, that will happen. So what could happen is not no deal, but the postponement or even the cancellation of Brexit.
There's very little evidence that the Commons wants that enough. There are people who don't want to leave, but how many of them really want to kick the electorate in the teeth? I would suggest not enough to make that feasible. And yes, of course, you're right that the government only exists with the confidence of the House of Commons, but I don't think any Conservative MP is going to vote against the government in a vote of confidence.
I mean, I suppose we could look ahead and speculate about what would happen if there is a deal, if it's voted down, whether you have no deal or the EEA or the postponement of Brexit. But we've probably explored that enough to give listeners an idea of how complex this is. So let's return to what we know and have in front of us, namely the white paper. I was very interested in what you said about it a few moments ago, that you thought it was bad, but this wasn't your prime objection to it. Your prime objection to it was that the government had effectively conceded a whole mass of ground without really saying so, and without really making it clear why it's done that, and without making it clear when it did it.
Yes, I agree with all those points. I think it is peculiar that DExEU was charged with drawing up a white paper. At the same point, without David Davis's knowledge, Downing Street was drawing up a completely separate paper, 120-page paper for the Cabinet. Now, that doesn't happen in a couple of days. There must have been some long-standing aim to get this Common Rule Book idea, and for Common Rule Book read European Union's rule book, idea into play without telling the Cabinet Minister in charge of the negotiations. This is a most unusual approach to Cabinet government.
Can I explain the sequence as I understand it, and we can try and work through it together? And I say this in the light of Conservative Home last week having published the whole of DExEU's white paper in 23 instalments, so we've had a chance to have a look at it. In the Mansion House speech back in March, the Prime Minister clearly nailed her colours to the flag of mutual recognition. So we wouldn't have ongoing harmonisation, we'd have mutual recognition. And this was consistent with everything that had happened before. Yes. There'd been a whole discussion at Chequers in January or February, I think, about the form that mutual recognition might take. So at some point between March and the emergence of this white paper, something changed somewhere, but we don't really know when. All I know is that the DExEU ministers were aware near the end of the process that, as it were, they're in one room writing their own white paper. Ollie Robbins is next door writing his own. But this happened very late in the day. When do you think the Prime Minister changed her mind?
Well, you don't even know that the Mansion House speech was precisely the view of the Prime Minister at that time. That is, on Mr. Maher's show yesterday morning, Sunday morning, the Prime Minister, when asked when this plan had first been thought about, wouldn't give any indication of when it had been, and it seemed to have been some time ago. March is not that long ago. It's very troubling, and I think the Prime Minister ought to be clear about this and should tell the electorate what the process was, what led to this, and why was DExEU not told when that was the department's job.
We're getting into very difficult territory here, but in essence, you're suggesting that the Prime Minister might not have been being straight when she delivered the Mansion House speech, that she might already have had an alternative model. Now, David Davis, in his resignation letter, and this has been rather missed by most of the media, basically said in terms the Prime Minister had not been upfront with him in everything that she did. So I'm coming back to where you began this section of the conversation. We have a question of trust here, and it doesn't seem to me that you now entirely trust the PM.
There is an issue of trust. Now, there is, of course, a difference between saying something that is untrue directly and not saying something that, if known, would be useful for people to know. The two are different categories in terms of trust. But there's an old joke in the city that when somebody says to you his word is as good as his bond, take his bond just in case. And that seems to me to be a sensible way to behave, which is why I put down amendments to the legislation.
Just thinking aloud here, isn't the Prime Minister entitled, if she so wishes, to have her ministers doing one thing and be drawing up another proposal in private with her advisers?
We have cabinet government in this country, and what is done ought to be agreed by the cabinet, ought to represent the policy of the cabinet. Collective responsibility does not mean everybody gets their orders from the Prime Minister. The line about Duke of Wellington's first cabinet, and he comes out afterwards and he says the most difficult thing, I give all this lot their orders and then they want to sit around discussing them. That's not how cabinet government works. It is a collegiate position which everybody then has to defend. The Prime Minister appoints ministers to certain roles. They have the seals of office from the Queen to carry out those roles. The Prime Minister doesn't have the specific authority to carry out those roles. The Prime Minister has a different role, which is to chair the Cabinet, to set overall policy, and to appoint the ministers in the first place. If she doesn't think the minister is doing the right thing, then the Prime Minister should appoint a new minister, not do it behind the minister's back in Downing Street. It's also a question of taxpayers' money. You know, we're all taxpayers, and our money was being spent doing two contradictory things. Half of that money was therefore being wasted.
You think it's not a good use of taxpayers' money, in effect, to have what Steve Baker called a Potemkin department?
That is a very good way of putting it. And it's not good constitutional practice for the Prime Minister not to have confidence in her own ministers to allow them to get on with the job they're appointed to do.
Do you have confidence in the Prime Minister?
I have confidence in the Prime Minister and do not seek a vote of no confidence in her. I've not written one of the letters, and I would always support the government in the terms of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. I would always support a Conservative government. Let's just qualify, just in case in 10 years' time we have a socialist government.
Digs up
it
this
digs up,
quotation.
yes.
Can we just roll events forward a little again in this way? That we have a sort of pattern of concession in these talks. Downing Street would say, and I think quite rightly, there have been concessions from the EU too, but now we have a very major change of direction from mutual recognition to ongoing harmonisation. This isn't the government's final position, is it? This is merely an opening bid.
There were briefings to members of Parliament on behalf of, by the Prime Minister's advisers, and this question was put very directly, is this the final offer? And the answer was no. They don't like to portray it as an opening offer, but it was clear that it was not a final offer, and therefore you would expect that the EU would come back with some demands of its own.
Well, you would indeed, because in some ways I think it's unfair to call this a soft Brexit proposal. It's really a bit of this and a bit of that proposal, in the sense that the EU is bound to come back on free movement and say, look, you can't possibly try to have access to one part of the four freedoms without access to all of them. They're bound to come back on services for exactly the same reason, and they're bound to come back on the court. Therefore, it's possible to imagine, isn't it, that the Prime Minister in a few months finds herself saying about the present position what she said on Sunday about mutual recognition. She might find herself saying it wasn't negotiable, in which case further concessions would be proposed. Isn't that the pattern?
The regrettable problem became clear in the interview with the Prime Minister with Mr. Marr, when she made that point about how people voted with their heart, and basically her job was to get on, deliver it with her head. And this had come up similarly, similar words in the briefing from her advisers. And the problem with that is that it means that the government at its highest level does not believe in Brexit. You see, people like me who campaign for Brexit think it is this wonderful opportunity that it's heart and head together. It's constitutionally right, it's economically advantageous, it will create a real opportunity for this country to be a global nation rather than tied into the failing European economic model. But the Prime Minister thinks that leaving is costly. and therefore, of course, she's not arguing for the best Brexit because she wants to be protected in this failing fortress Europe. And that is at the heart of the weakness of the negotiating position.
The Prime Minister is scarcely surviving the publication of these proposals. She wouldn't survive further concessions, would she?
Well, I suppose the hope from a unity of the Conservative Party point of view and the interest of the country point of view is that the European Union turns around and says, we are not accepting these, we want more. And the Prime Minister, recognising the political reality, says, OK, then it's got to be a completely different deal, basically a free trade deal on a Canada basis, and you put up a border in Ireland if you feel like it.
I just note in passing that Downing Street is no longer stressing no deal is better than a bad deal.
Again, look at the interview with Mr. Marr, and the Prime Minister seemed to think that any deal was better than a bad deal. But also there's a very interesting report in The Sun that said that Gavin Barwell had said Ireland isn't that important, and the Prime Minister always wanted a soft Brexit. Now, that's fine, that's not a dishonourable position. But the Prime Minister should have said so from the outset, and then we would have known where we stood. She should have said so to the voters.
What do you say to people who say to you, you were being purist and doctrinaire about all this, that you could bring down the Prime Minister, in effect, you might even bring down the government, and we will have Mr. Corbyn?
I've said very clearly that I will not vote against a Conservative government under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act vote of confidence, which is the only way of bringing the government down and getting to Mr. Corbyn. I would dispute that I've been doctrinaire. I have been willing to accept any number of compromises that I'm not enthusiastic about, so giving the EU £39 billion, which is more than I think we need to pay them, accepting a transition period, which is not an implementation period the Prime Minister initially called for, and the two are different, accepting that we might belong to certain agencies, accepting the very widespread compromises under the Mansion House speech, which weren't a pure in every form Brexit, were compromise that brought everybody together. The point at which people like me have dug our heels in is when we become simply a rule taker in perpetuity for our goods and agri-foods, severely limiting our ability to do trade deals with the rest of the world, and de facto subject to the European Court of Justice.
On that point, Donald Trump was telling the full, candid, unvarnished truth first time round at his interview with The Sun, wasn't he? Under the terms of this proposal, the government white paper, any trade deal with America would be off, whatever he said in a press conference at Chequers afterwards.
What he said in the press conference at Chequers, if you look at it carefully, confirmed what he'd said in the interview with Tom Newton-Dunn at The Sun. He said, you do whatever deal you want, that's up to you. I just want a deal that's good for trade. There was a conditional. So he showed his good manners at Chequers by not being unhelpful directly in front of his hostess, but he didn't actually change his position.
Do you think we should sue the EU?
I think we should be much tougher in the negotiations, and it's quite tempting, isn't it, to say, look, we've put in whatever it is, £500 billion since membership, and we're not going to give you any money, we'd like some money back instead. Of course you should be robust. You should always be... in negotiations, you should do two things. One is you should be generous on issues that are going to be settled in one direction anyway, where we should have been over people from EU member states living in this country. And the other is on the things that matter to you should be as hard as nails. We've been hard on the issues that don't matter, which we're going to give away anyway, and soft on the ones that really do. We've had the whole negotiation upside down.
It's not necessarily an endorsement of the proposal that we should sue the EU, but leaving that aside for a minute, what's your view of Trump?
I'm fascinated by him as a political phenomenon. I'm impressed by the things that he manages to get done in a way that most politicians wouldn't dare, that they are much more cautious, they're much more likely to follow the norms, whereas he throws the norms up in the air and sees where they fall. But he's done something remarkable in terms of his meeting with Kim Jong-un and potentially begun to unlock a very long-running problem that nobody else managed to do anything about. his Iran policy may turn out to be rather more successful than people initially thought. So I think he is an underrated politician because people don't realise about the way in which he needs to appeal to his electoral base. And remarkably, he delivers on his promises. He's done things that previous Republican leaders had promised and didn't do. And he's got in and he's done them. And I think either you shouldn't promise things to voters or you should do them. And to that degree, I think he is proving rather more successful than many people anticipated.
Have you met Steve Bannon?
Yes, I met him 6 months ago or so.
What's your view?
Very interesting man to speak to. Very well informed, obviously was very close to Donald Trump. I've only met him once, so I don't know him that well, but he is very, very well informed and with very strong views.
Some people would say, call a spade a spade. Bannon flirts with and helps to drive the alt-right, and Trump's attitude to Putin is a danger to the West.
I am very suspicious of Putin. I think we should treat Putin extraordinarily carefully, and we should remember that he has invaded countries or participated in invasions of independent sovereign nations, and he's murdered people in the United Kingdom. I mean, this is really serious. He is not a friend of ours, and when you sup with the devil, you should use a long spoon.
So Trump's attitude to Putin, does it worry you at all?
I want to see what happens. I think it's interesting that people have assumed that because there are certain similarities between Trump and Putin in terms of their big personalities that they might get on. It could be precisely the reverse. They could find that they're actually quite competitive with each other and that the relationship isn't as smooth as people fear. I am nonetheless concerned about what may happen between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I think one should watch it with great caution and see what happens.
And what about Bannon and the alt-right? An LBC producer, I think, quoted Bannon yesterday as saying that Tommy Robinson is a hero.
Well, I think that's simply wrong on Tommy Robinson, that I think our contempt of court laws are a very sensible protection of the right to a fair trial, and that freedom of speech is crucial, but so is the right to a fair trial. And standing outside a courthouse shouting abuse at somebody whose trial is underway has been illegal in this country since time immemorial. This is not a new piece of law. It's not a restraint of free speech. It is the ordinary desire to ensure that people have a fair trial. In the United States, of course, it's different. In the United States, the First Amendment protects free speech even when people are being prosecuted, but juries are sequestered in high-profile cases for much longer than they are in this country.
Very different sort of person. Boris Johnson, what do you think the future holds for him?
Oh, I think Boris Johnson is a very important political figure, very powerful, charismatic figure, popular, appeals broadly across the country. I'm a great admirer of Boris Johnson's.
What do you hope he does now? I mean, after all, he is the Leave politician with arguably, you're somewhere in the queue yourself, Jacob, but it's arguably got the biggest projection. He was the star force of the Vote Leave campaign. What should he do now? I mean, we suggested on Con Home this morning he should go out and take the case for Leave, the case against a second referendum, if you like, take it out and go campaigning around the country, which he's good at.
I certainly think those of us who want to leave the European Union need to be more campaigning. Essentially, we won the referendum and then stopped campaigning, whereas the other side lost the referendum and started campaigning, because they didn't try very hard other than trying to scare us witless during the campaign itself. So I read your piece this morning. I like the reference to Lord George Bentinck, the most interesting figure. To back Disraeli, he sold all his horses, one of which then went on to win the Derby, which he was understandably miffed about because it was his great life's ambition. Anyway, slightly beside the point.
He did die.
He died quite young.
He died quite young,
yes.
And Disraeli didn't win a majority, I think, until
1874. It's 28 years out of office. I don't see that happening to the Conservatives. I think we're more likely, as I said earlier, to reverse the policy than to split the party. And the great thing to remember is that Peel was right about the Corn Laws, and the Prime Minister currently is wrong about not leaving the European Union, de facto. So yes, I think some more campaigning. It's excellent to see that he's writing for the Telegraph again. That's a wonderful platform for him. And I think he was somebody who will help ensure Brexit is delivered.
Well, Jacob, I think we have one more Mogcast before the end of term. Goodness knows what condition we'll find everything in when we have it. It's been a pleasure speaking to you as usual, and...
Well, there is one important thing. I have to make a correction from my last podcast. I said the last Pope to be elected from outside the College of Cardinals was Urban IV. And I checked it afterwards. I am sorry to say it was Urban VI. I got my I's and the V's the wrong way around, so can I apologise to listeners to the Mogcast?
No one's intervened on you in the Commons to make the point.
No, but
I haven't had hordes of journalists chasing you to correct the record.
Which is surprising.
Of course, we know how much attention journalists pay to detail, on which point, thank you very much for correcting the record and for speaking to us. I've enjoyed this conversation very much and look forward to speaking with you again in a fortnight.
Thank you very much.
The Mogcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.